The moon never makes mistakes. Old Margaret had whispered years ago, but no one in the Hawthorne estate had believed her. And tonight, as the bells announcing the royal moon gathering echoed across Blackridge City, Clara Hawthorne sat alone behind a locked oak door while the rest of her family prepared to meet the Alpha King. Candlelight slipped through the narrow crack beneath the door, drawing a thin ribbon of gold across the worn wooden floor where Clara had spent countless evenings pretending the world outside still remembered she existed. The room had once been a nursery, then a storage room, and finally the place where the Hawthorns kept the daughter they called Broken. She wrapped her faded gray shawl tighter around her shoulders as another burst of celebration drifted through the old stone walls. Outside, carriages rolled across the cobblestone streets toward the royal palace, their polished wheels glimmering beneath the full moon. Music floated through the crisp autumn air, mixed with laughter, distant cheers, and the hopeful excitement of families dreaming that tonight their daughters might become Luna. Clara closed her eyes and imagined the lights she had never been allowed to see. She imagined grand chandeliers sparkling like captured stars, elegant gowns sweeping across marble floors, and hundreds of wolves waiting for the moment their future would change forever. She had never attended a moon gathering. She had never even stood in the palace courtyard. Ever since childhood, her father had insisted she remain hidden whenever visitors arrived. No one must see her, he always said with quiet certainty. People don't need another reason to laugh at this family. At first, Clara had believed she truly carried some terrible flaw that others could see the moment they looked at her. She had searched her reflection for years, studying every freckle, every strand of chestnut hair, every soft gray eye that looked back with more questions than answers. She found nothing monstrous, nothing frightening. Only an ordinary young woman who had somehow become everyone's greatest embarrassment. The heavy lock clicked outside her door, making her heart leap before the footsteps continued down the hallway without opening it. It was only another reminder that someone had checked to make sure she remained exactly where they wanted her. Forgotten. Invisible. Safe from curious eyes. She stood and walked toward the tiny window overlooking the back gardens. Beyond the iron fence, she could barely make out lanterns glowing across the valley where the palace rested atop Mooncrest Hill. Even from nearly 2 miles away, its towers shimmered beneath silver moonlight. Somewhere inside those walls, the Alpha King would soon arrive. Stories about King Ethan Blackwood traveled farther than merchants or royal messengers. Some called him stern. Others claimed he could read dishonesty with a single glance. Children whispered that wolves twice the size of ordinary alphas guarded his throne. Clara never believed the frightening tales. Whenever she secretly listened to travelers in the market, she noticed they all described something different about the king, but every story agreed on one detail. He always looked directly at people everyone else ignored. That single thought lingered in her mind longer than it should have. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Before Clara could answer, the door opened just enough for an elderly servant named Eleanor to slip inside carrying a small tray. Warm vegetable soup filled the room with comforting herbs. Eleanor smiled gently, the same way she always had since Clara was little. "They're almost ready to leave," she whispered. Clara nodded. "Is Olivia excited?" Eleanor sighed before answering. "Your sister has dreamed about tonight her whole life." Clara smiled despite the ache in her chest. "I hope everything goes perfectly for her." Eleanor studied the young woman for a long moment. "You're kinder than anyone in this house deserves." Clara lowered her eyes. Being angry won't unlock the door. Eleanor reached into her apron and quietly placed a small silver moon pendant into Clara's palm. It was old, scratched with age, but polished carefully. "Your grandmother wanted you to have this when the time was right." Clara's fingers trembled around the pendant. "Why now?" Eleanor glanced nervously toward the hallway. "Because sometimes the moon opens doors that people spend years trying to keep shut." Before Clara could ask another question, hurried voices echoed downstairs. Carriage doors slammed outside. Horses snorted impatiently. Her father's commanding voice filled the entrance hall, followed by Olivia's cheerful laugh and her mother's confident instructions to the servants. Eleanor hurried toward the door, but paused with her hand on the handle. "Stay hopeful, Miss Clara." Then she disappeared into the hallway, locking the door once more. Clara looked down at the silver pendant resting against her hand. For the first time in years, the tiny crescent felt unexpectedly warm. as though it had been waiting for this exact night. Outside, another palace bell rang across the valley, deeper than the first, slower, almost solemn. Without understanding why, Clara felt as though it had not been calling the noble families gathering beneath glittering chandeliers. Somehow, impossibly, it felt as though it had been calling someone hidden behind a locked door. Clara remained beside the tiny window long after the last carriage rolled away from the Hawthorne estate, listening as silence slowly replaced the bustle that had filled the house only minutes before. For the first time all day, no voices called her broken. No footsteps hurried past her locked room. The old mansion seemed to exhale, leaving only the faint crackle of fireplaces somewhere below and the distant bells from Mooncrest Palace drifting across the valley. She looked down at the silver moon pendant resting in her hand. It still held a gentle warmth that made no sense. It had been hidden for years, yet somehow it felt familiar, as though it had always belonged with her. Eleanor had said her grandmother wanted her to receive it when the time was right. Clara wished she could ask why. Her grandmother had passed away when Clara was only 11, but she still remembered soft hands brushing her hair and a quiet voice repeating words no one else ever dared to say. You are not less. You are simply early for a future no one else can see. As a child, Clara never understood those words. As an adult, she clung to them because they were the only kindness left from someone who had truly loved her. She carefully slipped the pendant around her neck. The cool silver touched her skin, and for just a heartbeat, she felt a strange calm settle over her racing thoughts. It faded almost instantly, leaving behind only quiet curiosity. She smiled to herself. Perhaps hope sometimes arrived so gently that most people never noticed it. Downstairs, a grandfather clock chimed 8 slow notes. The moon gathering would be beginning now. Noble families from every territory would be filling the grand hall, while musicians welcomed the guests. Olivia was probably smiling exactly the way their mother had practiced with her for weeks. Clara could almost hear the conversations. Which daughter will the Alpha King notice first? Which family will gain royal favor? Which future Luna will change the kingdom forever? Those dreams had never belonged to Clara. She had stopped imagining herself at the palace years ago. Instead, she found joy in much smaller things. The roses blooming behind the greenhouse each spring. Fresh bread cooling on Eleanor's kitchen table. The sound of rain against the attic roof. The tiny robin that returned every autumn to build its nest beneath the same oak branch outside her window. Those simple moments asked nothing from her except that she noticed them. A sudden gust pushed against the old window frame, carrying the scent of pine forests and cool mountain air into the room. Clara frowned. The palace sat nearly 2 miles away, yet for an instant she thought she caught another scent hidden beneath the breeze, clean cedar, fresh snowfall, and something wild that disappeared before she could identify it. She laughed quietly at herself. Too many stories, she thought. Too many evenings imagining a world she had never seen. She crossed the room and picked up the embroidery she had been working on earlier that week. Tiny silver threads formed the outline of a crescent moon across dark blue fabric. Needlework always helped quiet her thoughts. One careful stitch followed another until she lost track of time. Then she heard it. A sharp crash echoed somewhere below. Clara immediately stood. Another sound followed, hurried footsteps racing through the entrance hall. Voices rose in confusion. The front door opened and closed so quickly that cold air swept through the old house. Clara hurried toward her own door, pressing her ear against the wood. Someone was crying downstairs. Another servant rushed across the marble floor. She could not understand every word, but one sentence reached her clearly. The king has changed the order. Clara stepped back, surprised. Change the order? That was impossible. Royal ceremonies followed ancient traditions older than the kingdom itself. Nothing about them was supposed to change. More voices filled the hallway, louder now, carrying equal parts confusion and urgency. Eleanor's familiar footsteps stopped outside Clara's room. Instead of unlocking the door, she whispered through the wood, her voice trembling with astonishment. Miss Clara, something unexpected has happened at the palace. Before Clara could answer, another servant called Eleanor's name from downstairs. She hurried away without another explanation, leaving Clara alone once more. Clara rested one hand over the silver pendant beneath her collar. Its warmth had returned. This time it was stronger than before, steady as a heartbeat. Far across the valley, hidden beyond the darkness and glittering palace lights, the great ceremonial bells rang again. Their deep voices rolled across the hills with unusual purpose, and although Clara had never stepped inside the royal hall, she could not shake the impossible feeling that somewhere beyond those distant walls, someone had just begun searching for the one person everyone else had spent years trying to hide. The grand hall of Mooncrest Palace shimmered beneath thousands of crystal lights, each one reflecting across polished marble until the entire chamber seemed to glow like a lake beneath a full moon. Noble families from every corner of the Northern Territories filled the vast room with elegant gowns, tailored formal coats, quiet conversations, and carefully practiced smiles. Every parent believed destiny might favor their family before the night ended. Every unmarried daughter stood a little taller, hoping that one glance from the Alpha King might change the course of her life forever. Olivia Hawthorne stood among them in a flowing ivory gown embroidered with silver thread, exactly as her mother had planned for months. She carried herself with perfect posture, offering graceful greetings to neighboring families, while her mother proudly accepted compliments about her beauty and poise. Lord Hawthorne remained calm on the surface, but his fingers tightened around the polished head of his cane every time another noble family entered the hall. His greatest fear had never been that Olivia would fail to impress the king. His greatest fear had always been that someone might discover the daughter he had left locked away before sunrise. Around the hall, musicians played soft orchestral melodies while attendants carried sparkling glasses filled with chilled cider and fruit nectar. The scent of fresh cedar, mountain flowers, and warm pastries floated gently through the air, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a celebration than a royal ceremony. Yet beneath every pleasant smile lingered quiet competition. Every conversation eventually returned to the same question. Who would the Alpha King choose? At precisely 9 o'clock, the music faded. Conversation stopped almost instantly. Massive silver doors at the far end of the hall slowly opened, and every guest respectfully lowered their voice. Alpha King Ethan Blackwood entered without ceremony, dressed in a perfectly tailored black formal coat trimmed with subtle silver embroidery that caught the moonlight with every measured step. He wore no crown. He did not need one. Quiet authority followed him more naturally than any jewel ever could. His silver eyes calmly observed the room, not searching for admiration, but for something only he seemed to understand. Beside him walked Elder Rowan Ashcroft, the oldest royal advisor, whose thoughtful expression revealed years of careful wisdom. Ethan acknowledged the gathered families with a simple nod before taking his place beneath the ancient moon crest carved into the palace wall. Tradition required every eligible family to be presented one by one. The ceremony began exactly as it had for generations. Noble daughters stepped forward with elegant introductions, each displaying refined manners, education, and accomplishments carefully prepared for this very evening. Some spoke confidently about diplomacy. Others demonstrated musical talent or knowledge of ancient customs. Ethan listened politely to every presentation. He thanked each family with equal respect, yet his expression never changed. There was no spark of recognition, no curiosity, no sign that any introduction had reached whatever answer he had quietly come searching for. Minutes became nearly an hour. Murmurs slowly spread across the hall. Several nobles exchanged uncertain glances. This was not how the moon gathering usually unfolded. Ethan had not rejected anyone, but neither had he shown genuine interest. Elder Rowan leaned slightly toward the king and spoke softly enough that only Ethan could hear. "Your Majesty, the schedule continues as planned." Ethan remained silent for several seconds before answering. "The schedule is not what brought me here." Rowan studied the king's face. "Then what are you waiting for?" Ethan's gaze drifted across the hundreds of guests before settling somewhere beyond the palace windows, toward the distant hills resting beneath the moonlight. Someone who is not standing in this room. Rowan's weathered eyes narrowed slightly. He had served 3 generations of rulers and recognized certainty when he heard it. Ethan was not guessing. He was waiting. At that exact moment, a cool breeze slipped through the open balcony doors, carrying with it the faint scent of pine forests after autumn rain. Ethan became completely still. The quiet fragrance lingered for only a heartbeat before disappearing into the crowded hall, but something inside him responded instantly. His eyes lifted toward the northern valley where scattered estate lights shimmered beyond the city. It was distant, almost impossible to notice. Yet beneath countless perfumes, polished woods, and fresh flowers filling the palace, that single unfamiliar scent remained unmistakable. Calm, gentle, unhidden despite every attempt to bury it. Ethan slowly rose from his chair. Every conversation stopped again. The musicians lowered their instruments in confusion. Lord Hawthorne felt an unexpected chill travel through his chest without understanding why. Ethan looked toward Elder Rowan, his voice steady but carrying across the silent hall. "We will pause the ceremony." Surprise rippled through the gathering. Rowan blinked. "Your Majesty?" Ethan continued watching the moonlit valley beyond the palace windows. "Someone has been kept away from this gathering." The words settled over the room with quiet weight. No accusation had been spoken. No family had been named. Yet somewhere far beyond the palace walls, inside an old locked room overlooking the valley, the silver pendant resting against Clara Hawthorne's heart suddenly became warm enough that she instinctively placed her hand over it, unaware that destiny had finally begun walking toward her instead of away from her. Clara had almost convinced herself the strange warmth inside the silver pendant was only her imagination when another hurried knock echoed through the quiet hallway. This time the lock turned before she could reach the door. Eleanor stepped inside, her cheeks flushed from climbing the stairs, her breathing uneven with excitement and concern. She quickly closed the door behind her and looked over her shoulder before speaking. "Everything has changed," she whispered. The ceremony stopped. Clara stared in confusion. "Stop." Eleanor nodded. "No one understands why." The Alpha King interrupted the presentations himself. He said someone who should have been there was missing. Clara gave a small, uncertain smile. There must be another noble family arriving late. Eleanor did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked directly at the pendant resting against Clara's collar. "Perhaps," she finally said, though her voice carried little confidence. Before Clara could ask another question, loud wheels rolled across the front courtyard outside. Another carriage had returned far sooner than expected. Heavy footsteps crossed the entrance hall below, followed by sharp voices that carried through the old mansion. Lord Hawthorne sounded impatient. Lady Hawthorne sounded frightened. Olivia sounded confused. Clara instinctively stepped closer to the hallway door, hearing fragments of hurried conversation drifting upward through the staircase. "The royal messengers," one servant whispered. "They are checking every household." Another voice answered. "They said no eligible Omega may be withheld from the king's gathering." Clara slowly turned toward Eleanor. "What does that mean?" The older woman lowered her eyes. "It means the palace has sent officials throughout the city to confirm every family has obeyed the invitation." Clara's heart began to beat faster. Father would never allow. She stopped before finishing the sentence because they both already knew the truth. Lord Hawthorne had ignored the invitation the moment it arrived. He had simply erased Clara from the guest list without telling anyone beyond the household staff. Downstairs, another carriage door closed. Several unfamiliar voices greeted Lord Hawthorne with practiced courtesy. Eleanor quietly crossed to the window and looked toward the front drive. 3 riders wearing the silver crest of the royal court had dismounted beneath the lanterns. They carried no weapons in their hands, only official scrolls bearing the king's seal. Eleanor exhaled slowly. Royal inspectors. Clara felt the room grow strangely still. She had spent years believing no one beyond these walls even remembered her name. Yet tonight strangers from the palace stood only a few rooms away asking questions she had never imagined anyone would ask. Below, the conversation became increasingly tense. "There has been a misunderstanding," Lord Hawthorne insisted. "Only one unmarried daughter remains in this household." A calm, unfamiliar voice answered. "Our records indicate 2. Silence followed. It lasted only a few seconds, but those seconds felt endless. Clara looked toward the old family portrait hanging beside the fireplace. It showed her parents, Olivia, and an empty stretch of painted garden where she had once stood before the artist had quietly removed her from the final version at her father's request. She remembered watching the finished portrait years earlier without saying a single word. That had been the day she truly understood how invisible she had become. Eleanor reached for Clara's trembling hand. "Whatever happens next, remember who you are." Clara shook her head gently. "I do not think I know anymore." The older woman's eyes softened. Then perhaps tonight is when you finally find out. Before another word could be spoken, rapid footsteps raced up the staircase. The sound stopped outside Clara's room. A hurried knock came against the wood, followed by Olivia's voice, breathless and unlike the composed sister everyone admired. "Clara," she called softly. "Please answer me." Clara looked at Eleanor in surprise. Olivia had not entered this room in nearly 6 years. Eleanor quietly unlocked the door and stepped aside. Olivia stood in the hallway, her elegant ivory gown slightly wrinkled from the hurried journey home, loose strands of golden hair escaping the careful style she had worn to the palace. For the first time that Clara could remember, her sister looked genuinely uncertain. Their eyes met in silence. Olivia swallowed before speaking. "The palace knows about you." Clara felt every thought disappear. "How?" Olivia slowly shook her head. "I do not know. But the Alpha King has ordered every invited family to return before midnight with every eligible daughter present." The words hung motionless between them. Downstairs, Lord Hawthorne continued arguing with the royal officials, but his voice no longer carried the confidence of a man protecting his reputation. It carried the fear of someone whose carefully guarded secret was slipping beyond his control. Clara instinctively touched the silver pendant once more. Its warmth spread gently through her fingertips, steady and reassuring. While somewhere beyond the estate walls, beneath the same moon that watched over both palace and village alike, Ethan Blackwood quietly waited, certain that the person he had crossed an entire kingdom to find was finally closer than ever before. Clara stood motionless in the doorway while Olivia searched her face as though seeing her younger sister for the first time in years instead of simply looking past her. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. The silence between them held too many forgotten birthdays, too many family dinners eaten in separate rooms, too many apologies that had never been offered. Finally, Olivia stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Father does not know what to do." Clara lowered her eyes. "He has always known what to do. Hide me." Olivia winced, unable to deny the truth. Downstairs, another royal messenger calmly repeated the order from the palace. Every invited household was to return immediately, accompanied by every eligible daughter without exception. No excuses would be accepted. Lord Hawthorne's frustrated voice echoed through the entrance hall before fading into uneasy silence. Clara looked toward Eleanor. "If I go, everyone will stare." Eleanor smiled gently. Perhaps tonight they finally should. A few minutes later, Lady Hawthorne hurried upstairs without knocking. Her elegant appearance had begun to unravel beneath the pressure of the unexpected summons. She stopped in the doorway, her sharp eyes moving over Clara's simple gray dress before a look of disappointment crossed her face. "You cannot appear before the court dressed like that," Clara quietly answered. "You never intended for me to appear at all." Lady Hawthorne hesitated, clearly caught between pride and necessity. "There is no time for arguments. Eleanor, find something suitable." Without waiting for a reply, she disappeared into the hallway once again. Eleanor opened an old cedar wardrobe that had not been touched in years. Hidden beneath folded blankets rested a gown wrapped carefully inside white linen. She unfolded it with remarkable tenderness. Soft midnight blue fabric shimmered beneath the candlelight, embroidered with delicate silver vines that curled across the sleeves and hem like moonlit branches. Clara stared in surprise. "I have never seen this before." Eleanor smiled. "Because it belonged to your grandmother." Clara gently touched the fabric. It felt impossibly light beneath her fingertips. "She made this for you before she passed away. She told me one day you would need it." Clara looked at the older woman with growing emotion. "Why did no one tell me?" Eleanor carefully fastened the first button. Some promises must wait until the right hour. Within minutes, Clara stood before the old mirror. She hardly recognized the reflection looking back at her. Her chestnut hair, usually tied back without thought, fell softly across her shoulders. The deep blue gown made her gray eyes appear brighter beneath the candlelight, while the silver pendant rested naturally against the elegant neckline as though it had always belonged there. She still looked like herself. Nothing magical had changed. Yet for the first time, she did not immediately search for flaws. She simply saw a young woman standing a little straighter than before. Olivia quietly smiled. Grandmother would have been proud. Clara looked at her sister, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "Do you really think so?" Olivia nodded slowly. She used to tell me that beauty without kindness fades faster than autumn leaves. Before Clara could answer, a servant arrived at the door. The carriage is ready. The journey back to Mooncrest Palace passed beneath a sky filled with brilliant stars. Clara sat beside Eleanor, while Olivia remained unusually quiet across from them. Outside the carriage windows, the city glowed with lanterns, and families still gathered along the streets hoping to catch a glimpse of the royal procession. Clara had watched these same streets only through distant windows for years. Now she was traveling them herself, uncertain whether to feel fear or wonder. As the palace gates appeared ahead, towering beneath silver banners that moved gently in the night breeze, her heartbeat quickened. The carriage rolled across polished stone and came to a smooth stop before the grand entrance. Palace attendants opened the doors one after another as returning families stepped inside. Murmurs immediately spread through the crowd when they noticed an unfamiliar young woman following the Hawthorns. Curious eyes turned toward Clara. Some guests quietly counted. Lord Hawthorn had arrived with 2 daughters instead of 1. Inside the grand hall, the atmosphere had changed completely. The musicians remained silent. Noble families stood waiting instead of celebrating. Alpha King Ethan Blackwood had not resumed the ceremony. He stood near the great moonlit windows with Elder Rowan beside him, his attention fixed on the entrance as though he had been expecting someone rather than simply waiting for protocol to continue. One by one, the returning families entered. Ethan acknowledged each with calm courtesy, yet his expression remained unchanged. Then the Hawthorn family crossed the threshold. Clara instinctively lowered her gaze, hoping to disappear into the background one last time. At that exact moment, the silver pendant resting against her heart became warm once again. Ethan slowly turned toward the entrance. Across the crowded hall, through rows of nobles, polished marble, and countless flickering lights, his silver eyes found the one person who had spent years believing no one would ever truly see her. The conversations faded into complete silence. Clara felt it before she understood it. She looked up almost by instinct, and for the very first time in her life, someone looked at her as though she had never been invisible at all. Clara could not explain why the entire hall seemed to disappear the moment her eyes met Ethan Blackwood's. Hundreds of nobles still filled the room. Crystal chandeliers still shimmered overhead. Moonlight still poured through the towering windows. Yet all she could truly see were the calm silver eyes of the Alpha King, steady and thoughtful, holding no trace of pity or judgment. For the first time in longer than she could remember, someone was looking at her instead of looking through her. Ethan took one slow step forward. The movement was quiet, almost effortless, but it immediately drew every pair of eyes toward him. No one spoke. Even the attendants lining the marble walls remained perfectly still. Lord Hawthorn felt his heartbeat quicken as the king approached his family. He forced an uneasy smile and bowed respectfully. "Your Majesty, please forgive the confusion. My younger daughter has lived a very private life because she has always been fragile." Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he continued walking until only a few feet separated him from Clara. She instinctively lowered her gaze, uncertain whether she had somehow broken another rule she had never been allowed to learn. "What is your name?" Ethan asked gently. Clara looked up again, surprised by the kindness in his voice. "Clara Hawthorn, Your Majesty." Ethan repeated her name quietly, as though testing a melody he had waited years to hear. "Clara." Elder Rowan stepped beside the king, studying the young woman with careful attention. His eyes slowly drifted toward the silver pendant resting against her collar. A flicker of recognition crossed his weathered face. "May I?" he asked politely. Clara hesitated only a moment before nodding. Rowan examined the pendant without removing it, his expression growing more thoughtful with every passing second. Delicate symbols engraved along the edge reflected the moonlight, symbols so faint they were nearly invisible unless viewed from exactly the right angle. Rowan inhaled softly. "I have seen this craftsmanship only once before." Lady Hawthorn quickly interrupted. "It is merely an old family keepsake. It has no importance." Rowan calmly looked toward her. "On the contrary, this design belonged to one of the oldest guardian bloodlines in the Northern Territories." A ripple of surprise spread through the surrounding nobles. Lord Hawthorn immediately stepped forward. There must be some mistake. Ethan finally shifted his attention toward Clara's father. His voice remained calm, but every word carried quiet certainty. Then perhaps you can explain why a daughter connected to such a lineage has remained absent from every royal gathering for years. Lord Hawthorne struggled to answer. She was born different. We believed keeping her away would spare both her and our family unnecessary attention. Ethan's expression never hardened, yet disappointment quietly settled behind his silver eyes. Did you ask what she wanted? The question landed with greater weight than any accusation. Lord Hawthorne opened his mouth, but found no answer waiting. Clara stood frozen beside her family, overwhelmed less by the palace around her than by the simple realization that someone had finally asked about her wishes instead of making decisions for her. Eleanor quietly wiped away a tear from the edge of the hall. Olivia lowered her eyes in silent regret. Elder Rowan looked once more at the pendant before lifting his gaze toward Ethan. Your Majesty, he said carefully, I believe tonight has become something very different from a traditional moon gathering. Ethan nodded almost imperceptibly, never taking his eyes from Clara. Yes, he answered, because sometimes destiny does not arrive dressed for the celebration. Sometimes it spends years waiting behind a locked door until someone finally chooses to open it. The silence that followed Ethan's words seemed to stretch across the entire grand hall until even the flickering candles appeared to stand perfectly still. Clara felt every heartbeat echo inside her chest. She had spent years believing that speaking too loudly, standing too straight, or simply being noticed would bring disappointment to everyone around her. Now the most powerful man in the kingdom stood before her, waiting not for someone else to answer, but for her. Ethan's voice remained calm as he looked directly at Clara. There is only one person whose story I have not heard tonight. Clara blinked in surprise. Mine? She asked softly. Ethan inclined his head. Yours. She hesitated, glancing toward her parents almost by instinct. Lord Hawthorne lowered his eyes. Lady Hawthorne remained silent, unable to offer either permission or refusal. For the first time in her life, Clara realized no one was speaking for her. Elder Rowan offered an encouraging smile. Take your time, Miss Hawthorne. Clara drew a slow breath. There is not much to tell, she began quietly. I was told I was different before I was old enough to understand what different meant. My family believed hiding me would protect our name. After a while, I believed it would protect everyone else too. She paused, searching for words that had lived inside her heart for years without ever being spoken aloud. I never wanted anyone to feel ashamed because of me. So I stayed where I was asked to stay. I learned to enjoy small things. Reading by the window, helping Eleanor in the gardens, watching the moon from my room. I thought if I expected very little, I would never be disappointed. A gentle murmur spread through the gathered nobles. Many lowered their eyes, suddenly uncomfortable with how easily an entire room had accepted one family's silence without asking who had been missing. Olivia quietly stepped forward until she stood beside her younger sister. She is telling the truth, Olivia said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. Clara never complained. She never blamed anyone. She always wished the best for our family, even when we failed to do the same for her. Lady Hawthorne slowly closed her eyes, and the confidence she had carried for years seemed to disappear beneath the weight of her daughter's words. Lord Hawthorne removed his glasses and held them tightly in his hand. I believed I was protecting our reputation, he admitted, his voice barely audible. I never realized what it was costing my own child. Ethan listened without interruption. When Lord Hawthorne finished, the king stepped closer to Clara until only a respectful distance remained between them. He carefully removed the royal cloak fastened across his shoulders, a deep charcoal garment lined with silver embroidery representing the unity of every pack under his protection. Without ceremony or grand declaration, he gently placed the cloak around Clara's shoulders. The soft fabric settled over the blue gown her grandmother had made, and a quiet gasp swept through the hall. No one had expected such a simple gesture to carry so much meaning. Ethan looked toward the assembled nobles before speaking clearly enough for every person present to hear. No one should spend years believing they must disappear in order to deserve kindness. A kingdom grows stronger when every worthy heart is seen, not only the loudest voices. He turned back to Clara, his expression warm with quiet respect. You were never invisible. You were simply waiting for someone willing to look with honesty instead of fear. As the silver clasp of the royal cloak rested above the moon pendant at Clara's collar, both pieces reflected the moonlight together, And for a brief, breathtaking moment, the ancient symbols engraved upon the pendant shimmered with a soft silver glow that neither Clara nor anyone else in the hall had ever seen before. The gentle silver light faded from the pendant, but the feeling it left behind lingered in every corner of the grand hall. No one rushed to speak. The nobles who had arrived expecting a traditional ceremony now found themselves quietly reflecting on the young woman they had never known existed until a few minutes earlier. Clara lowered her eyes, overwhelmed not by fear this time, but by the unfamiliar sensation of being accepted without having to earn the right to exist. The royal cloak rested comfortably across her shoulders, warmer than its fabric alone could explain. Ethan stepped back just enough to give her space, his calm expression making it clear that he had not placed the cloak upon her to command attention, but to restore the dignity that should never have been taken from her. Elder Rowan slowly turned toward the assembled families. The purpose of this gathering has always been to honor truth, character, and the future of our kingdom, he said. Tonight we have all been reminded that appearances alone cannot reveal a person's worth. His words echoed gently through the silent chamber. Lord Hawthorne remained motionless before finally stepping toward his younger daughter. The proud posture he had carried for decades had disappeared, replaced by quiet humility. He looked at Clara with eyes that no longer searched for flaws, but instead saw years he could never reclaim. "Clara," he said softly, "I cannot return what you lost. I cannot erase the loneliness that my choices created. But I hope one day you may allow me the chance to become a better father than I have been." Clara studied his face. She remembered every closed door, every forgotten celebration, every evening spent watching the rest of her family from behind a window. Those memories would not disappear because of a single apology. Yet she also remembered something Eleanor had once told her. A wounded heart does not become lighter by carrying resentment forever. She answered with quiet honesty. "Forgiveness takes time. But I would rather build tomorrow than remain trapped inside yesterday." Lord Hawthorne lowered his head in gratitude, understanding that her answer was not a promise but a beginning. Lady Hawthorne stepped forward next, tears shining in her eyes. She gently reached toward Clara before hesitating, uncertain whether the gesture would be welcome. Clara slowly nodded, allowing her mother to take her hand for the first time in many years. Neither woman spoke. They did not need to. Some moments were too fragile for words. Olivia wrapped an arm around her younger sister's shoulders, smiling through quiet tears. "You spent your whole life cheering for everyone else," she whispered. "Tonight, let someone finally cheer for you." A ripple of warm applause began near the back of the hall, where several palace attendants stood watching. One by one the sound spread throughout the chamber until nobles, servants, advisors, and honored guests alike joined together. It was not loud or dramatic. It was gentle, sincere, and filled with respect. Clara looked around in disbelief. These were the same kinds of people she had spent years believing would laugh if they ever saw her. Instead, they greeted her with welcoming smiles. Ethan watched the moment quietly before speaking once more. Strength is not measured by how perfectly a life appears from the outside. It is revealed by the kindness someone chooses after enduring years of silence. His silver eyes met Clara's again. "You have already shown this kingdom the kind of heart that cannot be taught." Clara felt the weight of those words settle deep within her soul. For so long she had believed her story ended behind a locked door. Now she realized it had only been waiting for the right person to open it. As moonlight poured through the palace windows, the silver pendant resting beneath the royal cloak reflected a single bright beam across the polished marble floor, and Elder Rowan quietly smiled to himself because he recognized the ancient sign at last. The old guardian bloodline had not vanished from history after all. It had simply been hidden until the night the kingdom was finally ready to see it. The applause gradually softened until only the quiet music of the palace fountains and the gentle whisper of the evening breeze remained. Clara stood beneath the silver light pouring through the towering windows, feeling as though the world itself had somehow become larger than the small room where she had spent so many years believing her life would never change. She looked down at the royal cloak resting over her grandmother's gown, and then touched the silver pendant that had quietly waited for this night long before she had understood its purpose. It had never given her strength she did not already possess. It had simply reminded others to finally see it. Ethan stepped beside her, and together they looked across the grand hall where families, advisors, servants, and honored guests now smiled with genuine warmth instead of quiet curiosity. "The moon did not bring me here to find perfection," Ethan said softly. "It brought me here to find honesty, compassion, and courage. Those are far rarer gifts." Clara smiled for the first time without hesitation. "I spent years wondering why my path looked so different from everyone else's." Ethan looked toward the moon beyond the palace windows. "Sometimes the longest road leads exactly where it was always meant to." Elder Rowan approached, carrying an ancient parchment decorated with the royal seal. He bowed respectfully before speaking. "By tradition, every moon gathering concludes with a blessing for the future." He looked first at Clara, then at Ethan. "Tonight the blessing belongs to every soul who has ever believed they were unseen." He slowly rolled the parchment closed. "May every hidden light find the chance to shine." Those simple words settled gently over the hall. Clara turned toward her family. Lord Hawthorne stood beside Lady Hawthorne, both wearing expressions of quiet reflection rather than pride. Olivia smiled warmly and gave her younger sister an encouraging nod. Eleanor stood a little farther back, her hands folded together, tears of happiness glistening in her eyes. Clara crossed the marble floor and embraced the elderly woman first. "Thank you," she whispered. Eleanor smiled through joyful tears. "I only kept a promise. You were always the one who fulfilled it." As midnight approached, the palace doors opened onto the moonlit terrace where cool autumn air carried the scent of cedar and pine across the valley. Clara stepped outside beside Ethan. The same moon she had watched for years through the tiny window of her locked room now stretched across the open sky, without walls or barriers between them. She realized the moon had never changed. Only her view of it had. Ethan glanced toward her with the same calm kindness that had first met her eyes across the crowded hall. "Tomorrow will bring many new responsibilities," he said. Clara nodded. "I know." Then she smiled gently. "But tomorrow no longer frightens me." Ethan returned the smile. "That is because you finally know who you are." Clara looked once more toward the stars, remembering every lonely evening that had led her here, and instead of wishing those years had never happened, she chose to believe they had shaped a heart capable of understanding others who still waited behind their own invisible doors. The night ended not with celebration alone, but with quiet hope spreading through every corner of the kingdom, reminding everyone who witnessed it that true worth is never decided by fear, appearances, or the opinions of others. It is revealed by kindness that remains steady even when no one is watching. And somewhere beneath the endless silver sky, the story of the girl once hidden away became the story that countless families would tell for generations whenever someone felt forgotten, proving that the brightest destinies are often the ones the world almost fails to see. If Clara's journey reminded you that kindness and courage can change a life, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this story with someone who needs a little hope today. We would also love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us, which moment touched your heart the most? And do you believe every person deserves to be truly seen for who they are?